In this movie, we will be looking at a selector that can be applied to any object we want. This selector is the class selector. Now, in order to leverage this selector, we have to do three things. One, we have to create a name for the selector. Two, we have to define the rule. And three, we have to apply it to the appropriate objects. So unlike other selectors, it's not necessarily automatic. Class selectors will require us to use the class attribute to mark an HTML element to receive that particular style. So before we do that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the class selector and how we can name our classes. First of all, we should name things based on their purpose, not their location. So instead of having right sidebar, we should name it something like link sidebar. Now the reason why we want to do this is if we need to change the way that things are laid out. So let's say that our right hand sidebar, well, we no longer want it at the right, but we want it over at the left. We would change that property so that it would go over to the left. And then, unless we wanted it to be pretty confusing, we'd have to change the name of the class inside both the HTML attribute and inside the rule. So it's actually creating more work. So by basing names on purposes and not specific locations, it gives a little bit more flexibility. Now, CSS is case sensitive when it comes to naming. So whenever you come up with your class name, make sure that whatever it is that you use is repeated exactly the way that you originally used it. Otherwise, your classes are not going to work as you expect them to. Also, names must start with a letter, but can contain numbers, hyphens, or underscores. When in the style sheet, it must be preceded with a period, but when applied, you leave the period off. So this period is what your browser is going to use to designate something as a class style. And we're going to talk more about that and see it in practice in just a few moments. Now, if we want to, we can use a class selector combined with a type selector to have a more specific selector. So if we want to select all paragraph tags that have this class of highlight, then we could do p.highlight, and it will select just the paragraphs that have that class. Also, and more frequent, you have the class selector being used independently of any type. And again, we'll see that in practice in just a moment. Now, the rule can actually be created to fit the needs of the design. So what we're going to be doing with our class rules is creating those for specific purposes for our designs. And then as we need, we can evolve that rule to do what we need it to do. And lastly, an object can have multiple classes applied at the same time. So that's actually really powerful, and that's something we'll see in just a moment as well. So let's go ahead and jump over into our sandbox. And go to our style section. And the first thing I need to do here is to set up my style. So I'm going to go ahead and set up highlight. So here I've named it. It's dot highlight, and I want this to be pretty simple, so I'll do background dash color yellow. So it's pretty standard highlight. I'm also going to create something called complete. So I'll do dot complete. So here's where I was talking about it must be preceded by a period whenever it's in the style sheet. And so for this, I'm going to introduce you to another property called text decoration, and as you can imagine, that's what decorates the text. And we're going to do something called line through, which will put a line through the actual text. All right, now I want to come down here and I want to highlight, say, my first paragraph here. What I need to do is I need to add in the class attribute, and then the value for that attribute will be the class that I want to apply. So here I'll do highlight, and I leave off the period, So here I've marked the paragraph tag so that it's going to know to apply the highlight class. So if I save and refresh that really quickly, I'll see it's highlighting it. So then I'll go ahead and style this first list item so that it has the class of complete. I'll save that and refresh that. And as you can see, it's got a line through the text. Now you can go through and you can add these class attributes with the specific classes you want to apply to any item. And that's where the power of the classes really come into play. Now, I also want to go ahead here and say on the second list item that it's complete, but I also want to highlight it. So to apply multiple classes, I add in the name of the first class, and then I put a space, and then I put in the name of the second one. So if I save and refresh that, it highlights it, but it also marks through it. Now I also mentioned that we can be very specific as to what we want to affect. So I'm going to go ahead here and add in another class to the H1, and I'll do a highlight. And by default, if I just save this and refresh, it's going to highlight with yellow. So if I come up here to the top and specify that I want my H1 that has the highlight class applied to it, I can then set that without being afraid that it's going to affect any of the other highlights. So here I'll just do a background of lime. So there we go. So it's only affecting that one specific object. So as you can see, classes give us a very powerful way to select our HTML objects to apply our style information to them. Now because our class selectors are so powerful, they also tend to be some of our most common selector types. Another great thing about our class selectors is that they will allow us to apply this same class to multiple items across the entire page. So as you can see, we have the same highlight being applied here to our first paragraph and then being applied to our second list item. So that concludes this look at our class selectors.